So here I'm going to talk about the concept of comparative advantage in economics. I made a numerical example that can show the gains from trade and how two parties can specialize in the good that they're best at, and then they wind up selling that product and getting the product that they're not so good at. Right? And what we can show is that countries benefit from trade. Even if they're not the biggest, even if they're not the richest. Everybody can benefit from trade, which is actually a big finding, because a lot of times people think that trade hurts one country at the expense of another. So this numbers can show where the advantages come from, how you can show that one country is going to be able to gain from trade in a product. And then you see who trades what product, and then you can actually show numerically how the world or each country is better off with trade versus without trade. Okay, so the idea of the gains from trade is that both countries, right, if you look at two countries trading with each other, are going to be better off with trade than without. And it is going to show that if you do it right, no country loses at the expense of another. Right? This example goes back to David Ricardo in the 1800s. It's a classic textbook example. I think it was England and Portugal with wine and cloth. But it's some simple numbers. It kind of does some things right. It doesn't show some other things about the real world, but it basically shows trade is win-win or non-zero sum. Both countries are going to be better off with trade than without. It's very simple. It's known as being something that makes a lot of sense, but it's not intuitive. It means that people don't always see it without seeing an example of it. But that means a lot. A lot of times people think that the United States, for example, loses because of trade deals. Okay, so really both countries can win with trade, and these numbers are a good example of it. I like to talk about how this applies to individuals as well as cities. For individuals, one thing is that you could, for example, take a day off of work to paint your apartment. You think you're saving money because you're not taking time off, you're not losing, but you're actually losing pay. You think you're saving money because you're not paying a painter, but you're losing money by not going into work. Okay, you might be better off to make money at work, use some of that money to pay the painter, and you might wind up with cash in your pocket at the end of the day and a painted room, and you're paying a painter to do it. You actually both come out ahead. So comparative advantage comes in when you talk about why people specialize in activities and work a job and pay someone to do something else. I talk about cities as well. Sometimes, an educated workforce, a transportation node being located on water, good weather, all sorts of things might give countries, or cities a comparative advantage as well. So this can be extended beyond international economics, and it really does apply to individuals a lot. Okay. Now, the concept of comparative advantage is really a comparison of a comparison. Okay, and that's important. It's actually a double comparison. In the classic textbook case, we have two countries, right, and two technologies. Now, the technology is never really explained. It's just that one country is better at producing a good or two versus another. It's just made up numbers in a table, but the idea is that production technology drives this. It's never explained. Also, it has one factor of production. It has labor only. There's no capital. There's no land. Labor goes into the input and the products come out. But that's important because there's no diminishing returns. So if you're good at one thing, you just keep doing it until you run out of resources. There's never anything telling you to stop. Okay, so this is simplified in that sense, but the result is pretty clear. Right? Now remember, this is a comparative of a comparison. It's a comparison of a comparison. So really it's like a ratio of a ratio, or you can look at greater than or less than. The advantage part is comparing production of two goods in a country, and you're saying, am I better at good A or good B? Do the same thing for the other country. Now you have two comparisons, right? One for each country, and then you compare those ratios. So you compare within each country first, and then you look at between the countries and see which one has a higher ratio. Okay, so it's comparative advantage is a comparison of a comparison. I always like to put it that way. Okay, now I made up some numbers. These pretty much work. The idea is to show the gains from trade. The small country means that they don't have enough to trade with each other, but I'll explain that at the end. But for the most part, this shows that both these countries are going to gain from trade. So I have two countries, home and foreign, two goods, apples and pears. Right? I gotta keep it simple. Right? They're putting labor in to grow fruit, and they have an endowment, which means home has 10 workers and foreign has 20. So I made up these numbers simply for this example. Now home, this is the technology part, and I made this up too. Home can make 12 apples or 8 pears per worker. Foreign can make 3 apples or 1 pear per worker. So look at this. Home is really productive. A worker can make a lot of apples and a lot of pears. And foreign can make, right, they both make more apples than pears per worker, but home has a big advantage in both in absolute terms, okay? And so home is going to be better. It's going to be richer because it makes more stuff. Foreign is larger. It has more people. but it's going to be a larger, poorer country. Home is smaller but richer. And I think I just kind of made it that way because a lot of times people think that the poor country is going to lose in some way. Right? Now, I also like to look at this as productivity. I think of it in terms of production out. Sometimes textbooks look at input costs. Okay, so input cost, basically, you could flip this. You can make this a ratio, and I always make the point that high productivity is the same as low cost. If you're really good at something, you make a lot in an hour, or you can say I can get it all done quick because I'm so good at it. It doesn't cost me much time. High productivity and low cost are the same. So 12 is greater than 8. Productivity is greater, but if you flip it, you could say 1/12 is greater than, or excuse me, 1/12 is less than 1/8. All right, this only takes me 1/12 of a worker. All right, so you could flip it as just an inverse. You could get the cost as well. Okay, so I'm going to kind of look at it both ways, but I tend to look at it in terms of productivity. But an apple costs 1/12 worker at home and 1/3 worker in foreign. You could say it's higher cost in foreign, which makes sense because it's higher productivity at home. Okay, so it's lower cost at home, higher productivity at home, same thing. All right. Now, remember, we're going to draw this with production possibilities, frontiers, or PPFs. We're going to use the entire factor endowment. Home has 10 workers, foreign has 20. Home, if they use all workers, they can make 120 apples or 80 pears. Foreign, remember, it's 3-to-1 times 20, 60 apples or 20 pears. Now, home has absolute advantage. They are better at both products. They're better at both fruits. Home is, you think, like, how can they benefit from trade? And that's one of the key takeaways from this. Home is richer, foreign is bigger. Now you can write this mathematically: marginal productivity of labor, home for apples, home for pears, foreign for apples, foreign for pears. Although I know like the Krugman text does it with the notation, but I don't usually need to use it. But you might be able to write it that way. All right. Now the way I can set the costs and benefits equal to each other. One worker at home is 12 apples and 8 pears, right? If you want a pear, you have to take a worker out of apples. If you make all apples, you have 0 pears. How do you get a pear? You move a worker away, and then you're going to lose 12 apples to gain 8 pears, right? So that's going to be your cost, 12 to 8 or 1.5 to 1. All right, so that's the opportunity cost. If you want pears and you're making all apples, you have to move workers out of apples, which means you're going to have fewer apples to get more pears. And the ratio is this 120 to 80 ratio. Or you could say 12 to 8. Or if you simplify it, 1.5 to 1. That's the price ratio. If you want a pear, it's going to cost you 1.5 apples. Okay? Now, for foreign, that ratio is 3 apples for 1 pear. So 1 pear has a lower opportunity cost if you go this way. All right? It's going to cost you 1.5 apples, or for foreign, a pear costs you 3 apples. So that's the price difference. And we're going to find that any price in between will actually help both countries, because if you want apples, right? You might be able to find that it costs you, maybe it costs you 3 apples to get a pear, for example. Wouldn't you like to get 1 pear for only 2 apples? Right? Wouldn't you like to sell a pear to get 2 apples instead of 1.5 apples? So for the buyer and the seller, we find that for the seller of a pear, 2 apples is better. For the buyer of a pear, 2 apples is better because it's better than 3. So one of these countries is going to be the seller and one of these is going to be the buyer. And a price in between these is going to be mutually beneficial. Now I'm looking in terms of productivity, but again, you could flip it in terms of cost, right? So these are my ratios, and we're going to find that this is one cost and this is the other country's cost. And we're going to find a cost in between. But again, this is the 2 ratios. If we compare them, 3 to 1 is greater than 1.5 to 1, or if you don't simplify it, 3 to 1 is greater than 3 to 2. So this is the comparative advantage. We can look at how these ratios differ between countries. Now, for foreign, pears are expensive, right? If you want a pear, it's going to cost you 3 apples, right? At home, they're cheaper, right? It only costs you 1.5 apples. So you could look at it, foreign, pears are expensive, or you could say apples are inexpensive. It's the same ratio. You can flip these. You can put it in terms of 1 apple, right? Divide everything by the same on both sides. You can flip it in terms of which fruit. You can flip it in terms of turning it, in costs versus productivity. But we're not changing any numbers. It's the same numbers can give you different ways of looking at this story. Okay, so foreign, pears are expensive, or you could flip it and say apples are inexpensive. You could flip it another way and see 3 apples cost 2 pears at home. 3 apples costs, right? Double this by 2. Or 3 apples cost 1 pear in foreign. All right, and so all of a sudden apples are expensive at home. So apples are inexpensive in foreign, apples are expensive at home, pears are expensive at home. It's all different ways of saying the same thing. Okay, we can flip the numbers more. Again, I just flipped it in terms of instead of being one pear, this is one apple, but the same thing. 2/3 is greater than 1/3. All right, so again, looking at it this way, apples are expensive. They cost 2/3 of a pear at home, and they're cheaper in foreign. Okay, apples cost less in foreign. All the different ways of looking at this tell you the same thing. Foreign has comparative advantage in apples. How do we know that? Because apples are cheaper, all right, in foreign. Costs are lower, right? Apples are relatively inexpensive in foreign, and who has comparative advantage is who has the lower cost in producing the good. Who does it more cheaply? Who's more efficient? So all the different ways of rearranging this, foreign has comparative advantage in apples. Now, you kind of can guess that home has comparative advantage in the other product, but you can get the same thing. Comparative advantage in pears, if we look back, right, it's cheaper at home. So the numbers show us that too. Okay, that's where we get comparative advantage from, right? Who has the lowest cost? All right, so now we know who makes what. Foreign is going to make, right? They're going to make apples and sell them. Home is going to make pears and sell them. Because there's no diminishing returns, they're going to make only the product they're best at. There's no reason to quit if it's always cheaper. The prices don't change, okay? So here's how we draw. We've got our PPFs here. Here is home, which is larger in terms of productivity. It's got fewer people, but it's so productive, its economy is larger. The gray line is foreign. Foreign is more people, but it's poorer. Both countries are going to benefit. All right, here's the PPF. Remember, the one extreme is home only makes apples. They make 120. They have 0 pears. Or they make all pears. They have 0 apples. Or they could do a mixture in between. Any one of these combinations. They could split their workers 5 and 5, 6 and 4, whatever. It's going to be somewhere on this line. Foreign has the same thing. They can make all apples or all pears. All right. The big thing is that here's the slope is negative 1.5 for home. This is -3, right? This gap in the slopes means that there's going to be a way for both countries to benefit. And the slope, remember, is the relative price. It's rise over run. If you want pears, you go from the black dot to this thing. It's a rectangle. If you want them, you give up apples. So the cost you're paying, the opportunity cost, is giving up apples to gain pears. And you can make that the relative price of apples or pears, depending on how you look at it. Right? Now, this black dot is going to be without trade. This here is going to be production with trade, and this is consumption with trade. And the big point is that here, consumption is higher than production. That's super important because the country is living better with trade than without. So remember, this is the price for one country. This is the price for the other country. And we're going to find a price in between that works for both. Somewhere between 1.5 and 3 in absolute value is going to work. Okay, so here's the price of 2. These are parallel lines now. This is going to be better for both countries. This is a slope of 2, and it's going to be in between. Now, you could pick anything. You could have 2.9. You could have 1.6. Sometimes countries can negotiate. They can use non-economic power. You need to trade, but it's going to be even better for us. But in economic terms, you could having 1 penny is better than 0 pennies, so you're still better off even if it's more skewed in terms of one country or another. All right, and again, obviously this is pure trade theory, so I don't talk about all the unfair things in life right now. All right, so here's how it works. First of all, home, right, is going to only produce pears. And first of all, I picked this black point as autarky, which means they're not trading. I picked a point to make the numbers work, but it's pretty even balance. Right? It's a mixture. And if you can't trade, you have to spend resources doing things you're bad at in order to have those things. Okay, if you can't trade for them, you basically burn resources. You waste resources doing things inefficiently. So that's where this gains come from, is this country wants both goods. It has to do what it's bad at and what it's good at. Now, this is autarky. It can only produce and consume at the same point. It can only consume what it produces, all right? Now that's autarky. Here's autarky for the other country. Now you can open up the world to trade. Home is going to make only pears. Foreign's going to only make apples. Now they want both goods. So how do you get pears if you make apples? You sell them. Now here, remember this is a slope of -3. If you could trade for 2, right? You're going to get a better price for what you're selling. Now remember, it's flipped, right? But it's basically saying that instead of giving up 3 for one product, you're only giving up 2. Okay, but you could look at it in terms of 1/2 and 1/3 if that works a little bit better. But you can only produce pears, and then to get those, you only produce apples, and to get the pears you want, you sell some of those apples and you gain some of those pears. Okay, that's what we're going to do. Now, foreign, right? Foreign is going to be here. Now, home is going to be in the same situation, only they only make pears. So they're going to only make pears. How do they get apples? They are going to sell them and exchange them. All right, so here's kind of the terminology. Autarky is when you don't have trade. Each country is going to consume and produce at the same point. I made up numbers. In real life, you do try to get an even mix of both goods, right? So you're trying to get all the products, whether they're expensive or not. A lot of times I talk about maybe you are a northern country and you catch fish, but you want pineapples. If you want pineapples in Scandinavia, you have to build a greenhouse and spend resources to do it, or you can trade with another country. The cheaper way is to trade. You can free yourself up. But even then, no country wants to eat only fish and only pineapples, right? They want a mixture of both. It's just harder to get the thing that you don't produce, and it's cheaper to do it if you trade. Right, the price we saw, and I talked about this, you give up the high productivity good, right? Because you're spending some of your workers are making the low productivity product, or you're giving up the low cost good to get the high cost good. All right, and that's what you do under autarky. If you want both goods, you're going to have to spend resources to get the thing that you're not too good at. But with trade, both countries specialize in the good where they have comparative advantage. They do what they're cheapest at. It's the same way as saying they're doing what they're most productive at, right? And they're going to buy or sell depending on which side they're on. They're going to sell at this price between, all right, between those ratios. And I showed you it's between 1.5 and 3. And you're going to consume more than you produce. All right, so how does this work? Okay, first of all, I showed you those dots, and what I have here is that home splits 10 workers, and I just have 4 grow apples and 6 grows pears. Production has to equal consumption, and that is 48 apples, right? Because it's times 12, 48 pears, all right? And that's 6 times 8, okay? Foreign's going to split its 20 workers, 8 and 12, and again, I picked it just so the numbers work smooth. Total production is going to be consumption too. Only here it's 24 apples, remember, because it's 12 times 2. And here, this is 12 times 1, and that's 8 times 3. Okay, so that's the number. That's how they split. It's close to 50-50, but the numbers work better if I do it this way. That's autarky. You could see exactly how many apples and how many pears they get. That was the black dot on the graph. All right, that is autarky. Now with trade, home is going to make 80 pears, and that's that corner rectangle. Foreign produces 60 apples, and that is here, right? Home makes 80 pears. Foreign makes 60 apples, and they're going to be able to sell. So foreign is going to sell apples to get pears and vice versa. They can sell at any point between 1.5 and 3. I picked 2 just because it's round. It's not exactly halfway, but no one says it has to be that way anyway. Now home is going to export 30 pears to get 60 apples. And I just made that up, again, to show you those points, and that was the white dot above it. Foreign is going to export 30 apples and get 15 pears. Now, this does not equal each other, and that's part of the size differential. I don't care that they don't line up, and that does not work mathematically, but I just left it. But with the numbers, right, they're going to produce, home produces 80 pears, keeps 50, right, and they sell the rest, and this is what they wind up with, 60 apples, 50 pears. This is bigger for both, right? They get more of each. Foreign is going to produce apples, it's going to export apples, and it's going to sell for pears at the price of 2, right? These are the 2-to-1 ratio. And here, it's better off as well, and that was the white dot as well. So consumption is higher than production, okay? So here are those dots again. This is the autarky point, all right, where again, you're kind of wasting resources to get both goods. The better solution is to trade. You completely specialize, but you don't want to consume the product you're making, so you're going to sell it for the other at that price of 2-to-1. Same thing for this country, for foreign. They produce apples, but they're going to wind up consuming apples as well as pears, and they consume more than they produce. So how do you get those, get the product you're not producing? How does home get apples? They export the apples, right, and they export the pears. They export the pears and import the apples, and at the numbers I give you, exporting 30, selling them for 2 each, gives them more than they would have had without trade. And that's the key point, is that consumption, well-being, you could draw a utility line if you want. Every measure of well-being is going to be higher with trade than without. And where it comes from is these 2 ratios are different, right? And that has to do with the relative productivity and costs in the country. We were able to find out who has a ratio, who has lowest cost or highest productivity, which says who makes what. And then once that is determined, that who makes what, then we can say how do they gain? And they gain by making the good they're best at, selling it, buying the good that they're not as good at, and because they're freeing up resources, they're outsourcing to the other country that does it at a lower cost, they are able to be consume higher, or they're able to be better off with trade than without, right? So comparative advantage, as a simple example, doesn't exactly match the real world, but it shows a really important thing is that both parties can benefit by outsourcing the worse good and specializing in their better good. If both countries do that, both countries are better off, regardless of their size, regardless of their overall productivity. Both sides can gain, and trade is win-win.